the final presentation of the study named Optimizing Our Streets Design for Safety and Development. I am Elizabeth Stevens, president of the Downtown Mobile Alliance, and we're so excited that so many of you signed on tonight to listen to how we can design our streets for safety and proper urban development. Last autumn, we received a large grant from the J.L. Bedsole Foundation to conduct this study. And we hired Jeff Speck, the walkability advocate and planner that had been to our city to speak in the past and to visit his brother, symphony conductor. And he brought along the lovely firm of transportation firm Nygaard and Allison Fletcher, who'll be with him tonight. And the point of our study was how can we figure out a way to design the streets downtown to make them feel safer and more prone to traditional urban development that we've been promoting for many years now. And some of you were probably with us on October the 28th, the night of Hurricane Zeta. Zeta's winds blowing out things in my yard and other people's houses, I'm sure. And where Jeff presented a kind of an intro to the plan and what he was going to do in Mobile and what his concept is. And then this was followed by numerous Zoom committee meetings with almost 200 people from different stakeholder groups, neighborhood groups, advocacy groups of one form or another, and giving the team feedback on issues that they see and would like solved. We created a steering committee of 18 people chaired by Chris Lee. Thank you, Chris. And that committee met, throughout November and December, kind of giving guidance and bouncing at and letting Jeff and Allison bounce ideas off of them as they kind of proposed street by street transformations. 6 members of the committee were from the city: Councilor Manzi, directors Jim Delat, Matt Anderson, Jennifer White, and Jen Green, and Assistant Director for Traffic Engineering, Mary Beth Bergen. The cooperation of the city has been excellent. And we thank Mayor Stimson. Mayor Stimson, I know you're on the calling in tonight, and we thank you and your team for your deep and abiding commitment to improving downtown in this way. Again, I mentioned the issue of virtual planning, and to all of you with us tonight and through this process, we freely admit that virtual is not the ideal way to do public planning. But we felt like it was best to move forward and not wait for the unknown right time, especially in 2020 when who knows what the future would have been. Now, hopefully you'll agree, because really the real work begins tomorrow when we all begin advocating for implementation. The report itself that Jeff and Allison will present tonight provides a plan for every street, how it can be managed and designed in a manner that will feel safer for pedestrians and cyclists, and thereby dramatically increasing the viability of the adjacent properties for residential, retail, or office uses. And really, the urgency couldn't be greater. Just 2 weeks ago, Alabama was declared the 2nd most dangerous place in America for pedestrians. And really, sadly, Mobile is a certain contributor to that statistic. Tonight's report presents solutions that, if followed and implemented, will make downtown Mobile a safe place for cyclists and pedestrians. Now, a little housekeeping. The presentation is being recorded. Should you want to share it with neighbors or rewatch it, we should have it loaded by Wednesday evening or Thursday morning on the Downtown Mobile Alliance's YouTube channel. You can review it there along with the the initial presentation. The report itself is already available for download in the Reports and Studies section of our website, downtownmobile.org. And then regarding questions, please note the Q&A tab in the middle at the bottom. It's lit up with a red 1 right now. It's best if you submit some questions as you come to them and throughout, and just not wait and all pile it up at the end. Allison will endeavor to compile them and feed them to Jeff and so that he can respond. If you do not get your question answered, just call our office this week, and we will certainly endeavor to get your questions answered. And with that, I thank you again. I thank you all for joining us to talk about this topic, to make our city a better place. And I turn it over to two people who can help us do that, Jeff Speck and Allison Fletcher. Thank you.
I had to stop sharing to unmute. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Elizabeth, for that kind introduction. I am very glad that we did this when we did it. If we hadn't done it, we wouldn't have started it yet. And so it's great to be largely finished and to have a report and a plan and a series of recommendations to share with you that you can act on immediately. It was suggested by my brother that I share with you that those of you who are curious should know that it is not our plan that has caused it to be difficult for you now to turn onto Broad Street from Government Street. That was already happening before we got involved. As you know, there's a lot of construction happening on things that were planned well in advance and are coming to fruition now. But this plan is for things that are going to be happening in the future. One hopes very quickly, and one expects for some of these things very quickly. And I'll be speaking about that more as we conclude. Let me share my screen. And I want to introduce Allison Fletcher of Nelson Nygaard, who's going to wave, but she'll have more to say in a minute, who's been my partner on this, as Nelson Nygaard has been on many of my walkability studies through the years. And this has really been a joint effort among us and the staff at Nelson Nygaard. Allison, does that look good? Smile if it looks good. So this study is called Optimizing Downtown Streets, Designing Downtown Mobile for Safety and Development. And we're going to talk about both. And it's important to understand that one really depends on the other. That if downtown doesn't feel safe and comfortable to walk around, then it won't succeed, it won't develop in the way that we hope. And that's why, you know, when we do these studies, they're sponsored by all different organizations, and often it's the city that sponsors them, but often they're sponsored by organizations like Downtown Mobile that really it's their mission to see the downtown thrive. And so they share our understanding that the design of the streets and the feeling of comfort and safety in those streets is going to be a key ingredient in having a successful downtown. Sorry I can't be there. I'm especially sorry I can't be there in the beautiful spring that you have in Mobile. I'm sorry my brother's in town, and I'm sorry I can't be there to celebrate with him after this is completed. Usually when one of these is over, we go out, we have a nice dinner. I'll just have to have you know, a celebratory drink here all by myself. But the only reason I was willing to do this plan during COVID at a time that I couldn't spend time there was because I know the city already. Could I know it better? Sure, but I have spent a lot of time there. And I have to say, Alyson and I kept track. We spent literally hundreds of hours virtually, thanks to all the wonderful tools available, virtually walking your city. And actually, I'm dying to get back because I feel like I know it so well now, and it'll be great just to be there in person to see in real life what we've been caring so much about in the last 8 months, and will continue to be caring about as it gets implemented. As Elizabeth mentioned, we had a lot of meetings, about 14 official meetings, a few other unofficial meetings, and then of course, lots of casual conversations and unofficial other things that had us spending time there with you. We did speak to a couple hundred people. We do feel like this is a plan that has grown out of a real mutual effort, and we think it represents the goals and desires of the community. I always like to share my plan notes when I'm presenting these, just to give you a sense of the sort of detail that we get into as we're doing this work. And believe it or not, everything we wrote here pretty much became something in the plan. I wanted to briefly introduce Nelson Nygaard and Allison so she could tell you a little bit about their firm. I choose to work with them on almost all the projects I do of this size because I do believe that Nelson Nygaard is the best among the progressive transportation planning firms in the country. There are plenty of firms that do things the old way. Nelson Nygaard for many decades has led the field of transportation planning in implementing the latest and best practices, and I'll let her tell you a little bit more about them, and then actually she's going to briefly take you through the organization of the report itself. I'm not going to be talking much about the plan, but we're very, you know, when we're gone, all we leave behind essentially is this document, this video, and that document. So I want you guys to understand the plan. I want you to go to the website when this is over and download it. And I want you to, you know, be able to you know, have a facility with using it. So Allison, please say hello and tell us a little bit about the plan document itself.
Yes, hi, thanks, Jeff. As Jeff was alluding, this slide kind of encapsulates who we as Nelson Nygaard are as transportation planners with a mission of creating more just, sustainable, connected, and beautiful places through transportation planning, which is a mission and value that we share with Jeff and also with the Downtown Mobile Alliance, which is why they hired us for this plan, as we've been discussing. We've collaborated with Jeff on numerous plans across the country, and in all of our work, try to bring a national perspective to the best practices in these plans. Most recently, we've worked together in Rogers, Arkansas, and in Tulsa, Oklahoma, both of which have been readily implementable plans delivering fast results on streets, which is what we hope to do here as well. We have offices all over the country, and we've been leading the traffic analysis component of this plan in addition to the plan production and the planning supports to Jeff's work. And we've been fortunate to work in partnership with the city as part of this process. We have a lot of great leaders amongst your engineering department already, and with them we were able to identify and how to leverage low-hanging fruit opportunities for increasing safety on streets, as Jeff will explain over the course of this presentation. So on the next slide, I'm going to introduce you to the plan itself. This is the cover. You'll find it on the Downtown Mobile Alliance's webpage, as they mentioned. And this is the general overarching structure of the report itself. There's a part 1, there's an interlude, there's a part 2, and there's an appendix. And on the next slide, in part 1, that is categorized roughly into 10 different key ways that streets can be approved applicable to the downtown Mobile streets context. Jeff is going to walk through these in great detail, but this is generally how that section of the report is organized. And then in the second section of the report, part 2, that walks through the street-by-street modifications, with them grouped in the streets that run from east to west in your downtown, those that run in north to south, and those that run diagonally, which are much fewer. And as an example, this is a layout for one of the pages for St. Michael Street and the recommendations. And you'll see this as the structure for how we discuss most of the streets. So there's an image of what the street looks like today. There's a graphic that explains the key change happening to that street. Sometimes it's a typical change, sometimes it's a specific block by block change. And then there's a column that explains, you know, some of the key data points and the changes that are happening for that respective street. And so that'll be kind of the framework for each of the streets as you read through it. So I'm going to pass it back to Jeff, who's going to explain all of this through the form of the presentation tonight. So thank you.
So thank you, Allison. And I also want to acknowledge tremendous participation and I would say creative thinking from engineering staff, public works folks, others at the city, and of course the Bedsole Foundation that supported this study deserve our gratitude as well. So I'm going to take you through what for Mobile are the 10 steps of walkability, or the 10 steps of making Mobile feel safer and actually be safer for pedestrians. But it all boils down essentially to driving speeds. It's a remarkable condition in cities that, you know, a car going 35 miles an hour is about 7 times as likely to kill you than a car going 25 miles an hour. And so that difference between 25 miles an hour and 35 miles an hour, which is the speed that people are often driving in our city centers, is a super important difference. And the question is, what can we do to have drivers, while they're downtown, closer to the lower end of that scale? Elizabeth mentioned the data that had most recently come out, and it's disappointing to learn that that among the most dangerous places to walk in the United States, Alabama as a state jumped up 2 places in the last 2 years, surpassing, I believe, Texas and maybe New Mexico to become the second most dangerous state in the US. A point I want to make is that, you know, most of that's not happening in downtown Mobile. Downtown Mobile is the kind of place where people do drive generally slowly, more slowly than they're driving in the rest of the state. And it's the roads that are the exception to that rule that deserve most of our attention. You know, this image from the book could easily be replaced by this image from Government Street. Clearly, there are certain streets in downtown where people are driving quickly, but also we do have a condition, as I will explain, where almost every street is inviting speeds that are slightly higher than they could be inviting, in a way that if the cars could be calmed a little bit and people actually would go the speed limit, you'd have a much healthier and more productive downtown. So moving into the plan, in terms of safety and safety that will lead to development, this is the map of injury crashes in the downtown, and you'll notice how the key works. Essentially, you know, anything that's yellow isn't very safe, and orange and red is quite unsafe. And you can see a condition where it's essentially on your perimeter, right? In the wider, in the faster moving streets, on Broad Street, which, as you know, is under reconstruction to make it safer, particularly for bicyclists who will be given their own path there. Water Street, but Government Street, which is the real anomaly that slices through the heart of the downtown, is where you find the great preponderance of injury accidents. And that's what we really look at. You know, there are going to be fender benders all over a city, but the question is, where are people getting hurt? Because that's an indication of the places that really we have an obligation to make safer. You can see that most of the downtown is quite safe. If you remove government from the equation, it's really just, you know, particularly some of these western stretches, and I'm going to call your attention to Dauphin Street more as we move into the report, but you know, it's principally in this western part of the downtown core where there's danger to worry about. There are, whenever I do this in a city, there's usually between 8 and a dozen things that city can change to make itself safer downtown. In this case, we have priorities and an introduction. So actually there are 10 items, 10 different things that can be improved in downtown. And these are them. I'm gonna not explain them now. I'm gonna go through them one by one. But no more driving lanes. So these are the things you can do to make downtown more safe. Having no more driving lanes than you need to handle traffic, having lanes of the right width, having few one-way streets, or at least fewer, having continuous on-street parking as much as you can, having a useful bike network as opposed to just a decorative or sporadic one, having fewer center lines in your street and actually more stripes that delineate the parking at the edge of the street, having fewer swooping geometries which encourage speeding, having fewer curb cuts across sidewalks where drivers are crossing sidewalks with their cars, replacing traffic signals with always stops wherever possible, and I'll explain why. And finally, the kind of obvious one, but one that still needs attention, is having proper crosswalks and, where appropriate, pedestrian crossing beacons. So those are the 10 things, and we're gonna, the whole discussion today, except for the end where I'm gonna talk about priorities, the whole discussion today is taking you through these 10 steps and describing the changes then that each step suggests. Now, Allison showed you how the plan was organized into 2 sections. One is the 10 steps, and the other is the street by street analysis. I'm not going to take you through the street by street because that would just be incredibly mind-numbingly painful and time consuming. However, what I've done is to illustrate each of these conditions, each of these 10 things to change, I have chosen a number of streets, in fact, most of them, to which that pertains, And so I'll show you that as we go. So it's going to be a bit of a tour of downtown as we go. Now, speaking of tours, you know, it took a long time to learn the names of all your streets, all your saints and everyone else on your streets. And it struck me that maybe not all of you are completely familiar with all of your streets. So I did think it would be useful for 60 seconds to start out just to remind you of the names of all your streets. So what we're going to do is we're going to march from east to west on the north-south streets, and then we're going to march from north to south on the east-west street. But let's remember, we have water on the water, and then it's Royal, St. Joseph, Conception, Joachim, Jackson, Claiborne, Franklin, Lawrence, Hamilton, Lawrence, Cedar, Warren, Dearborn, Washington, right, the larger street that cuts through there, Scott, Bayou, Jefferson, and then Broad at the edge. North-south, you have Beauregard, the major street, and then you have Adams, Congress, State, St. Anthony, Louis, Michael, and Francis, the four saints, Dauphin, your main street, Conti, Government, your principal vehicular throughway, and then Church, Monroe and Civic Center, Islava, and then Canal at the bottom. You also have the diagonals of MOK and some other smaller streets up here like Chestnut, and then Spring Hill in this location. That's your map. So let's go one by one. The first thing, and it's kind of obvious, is you don't want to have more lanes than you need. The more lanes a street has, the more it looks like a highway, the more it operates like a highway, the faster cars go, the further you have to cross. This is Oklahoma City, where I rebuilt, I worked on a team that rebuilt the whole downtown core, and we counted the number of trips. And the key thing here is we call it a street audit or a lane audit. And we count the number of lanes and we count the number of trips. And we compare the number of lanes to the number of trips. And we understand we need to have a certain leeway in there for growth and other things, right? But we look at the peak hour, the most congested hour. We know what a lane can handle. And what we found in Oklahoma City, as we find in most cities, is that there are at least some streets, you know, in places like Boston, there's almost none. But in most cities, there are some streets that have more lanes than they have traffic. And that means the opportunity to get rid of lanes. So here in Oklahoma City, a typical street, we were able to turn it from this into this. And I always say, you know, and this is the way to do it expensively. In Oklahoma City, they had a lot of money. They spent $200 million. I always tell cities, though, you know, you can restripe a whole downtown for the price of repaving, or I should say, sorry, rebuilding a few streets. And so a more typical job that I think is more analogous to what we propose for Mobile is Cedar Rapids, where a typical street looked like this, and we did the car counts and we were able to turn it into this. And this is the day it opened, which is why there are cones and someone parking in the bike lane. But that's the sort of thing that we've been doing now for 20, 25 years all around the US. And it's a simple function of counting the lanes. And if you count the lanes right, you don't have a congestion problem afterwards. And I have to say, in Oklahoma City, where congestion was predicted, there was no congestion. And in Cedar Rapids, where congestion wasn't predicted, there was no congestion. So what you see here is the map of existing travel lanes in downtown. And not to get into too much you know, inside baseball, but a two-lane street can handle typically 10,000 car trips per day. So that's, you know, 5,000 each direction. Very normal for a two-lane street to handle 10,000 cars a day. And if you have fewer than that, then you don't need a two-lane street anymore, although, you know, most two-way streets need to be 2 lanes at least. And this is your map of volumes downtown. And what you see here, if you look at the key on the left, is that yes, there's a lot of cars in water. There's a lot of cars in government and in the highway on and off ramps. But remarkably, you do not have, if you remove the Henry Aaron Loop and Government Street, you actually do not have a single street in your downtown core that's carrying more than 5,000 cars per day. So it's half the amount of cars that a 2-lane street requires. So, and I should say that the main reason this occurs is because you have an incredibly robust, porous, small block grid where there's so many choices of different streets that you can take to go north-south, to go east-west. Most cities are not blessed with this. And I should say that in the context of these studies that we do, and Allison can tell you about Tulsa and other places where we work, it's a very difficult negotiation to convince folks that even though there's congestion downtown, there are certain streets which are oversupplied with lanes, because some of the streets are undersupplied with lanes. Here we have a condition which is absolutely remarkable and which I haven't experienced since Cedar Rapids, where you have no problems in any of your streets. There's not a single one of these streets, aside from the highways and the perimeter, that cannot be 2 lanes or less. And so actually we have a condition which we rarely face in our studies, which is that we can make the streets what they want to be and not worry about congestion. So that's just a great enabler for us. To get into a little more detail, here's the list, here's the map again of demand, and here's the map of, sorry, you hadn't seen this before. This is the map of demand. So this is what this creates in terms of the number of lanes you need, and here's the number of lanes that you have. So if you compare them, the lanes in red, the lanes flashing in red, are actually extra lanes that can be put to better use. What is that use? That use could be parallel parking you don't have. It could be bike lanes you don't have. It could be, in certain cases, narrowing the street, although that requires construction that we don't recommend typically because of the cost. Now, Canal Street is one of many streets, you know, and we can talk a lot about Canal, but it was created as a highway for traffic that never came. You've already restriped it to remove one of its lanes by turning that lane into a bike facility. So now Canal only has about 2.5 times as many lanes as it needs, as opposed to 3 times as many lanes as it needs. But you can see that there's excess capacity there already still. In fact, we'll talk about Canal, but the biggest challenge with Canal, unless you rebuild it, the biggest challenge with Canal is that there's really nothing else you can put there because there isn't demand right now for much parking on it. So in fact, our short-term recommendation for Canal is to leave it the way it is, albeit to better protect the cycling, because we don't have a better use for all that asphalt. Congress Street is another street coming in from the west with 4 lanes that only needs to be 2. Spring Hill coming in from the northwest with 4 lanes only needs to be 2. MLK has between 2 and 4 lanes, depending on whether this illegal parking is made legal or not by someone along the curb. But 3 to 4 lanes only needs to be 2. Washington Street, as it approaches in the southern part, as it approaches Canal, has an extra turn lane on it that it doesn't need. Royal Street has turn lanes in the center that it doesn't need, that are making it impossible to park on this curb, for example, which businesses on that curb would very much like. Claiborne, heading south of Government, has a lane more than it needs, etc. These feeder roads along the highway that connect Water Street to Canal Street and actually could be an important part of having a circular bike network have twice the lanes that they need. And Dauphin, west of Claiborne, where it is 2 lanes eastbound most of the time, has a lane more than it needs to carry traffic. So you see all those lanes I mentioned in red. I may not have mentioned them all, but that's all money in the bank. And there's really a couple things that are money in the bank when you're doing these plans in terms of opportunity for making the downtown better. The other one is the width of the lanes. So that's the second item. Lanes at the proper width. Now, we've known for some time that the wider lanes are, the faster people drive. Generally speaking, a 10-foot lane is the proper width for a high volume downtown lane. NACDO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials, has made this very clear. And the reason they've had to make this clear is that over the last few decades, starting really in the 80s, there was this kind of mission creep, and lanes taken from highway design, in which you want wider lanes because people are speeding, taken from highway design into downtown design. Downtown lanes in many municipalities became 11 feet wide, 12 feet wide. And in some places I work, like Albuquerque, that's still the rule, although it wasn't until we fixed it a 12-foot lane, which is a 70-mile-an-hour lane. There's no reason to have a 12-foot lane that would induce speeding when you could have a 10-foot lane instead. And so that's an important model to understand. Another thing to understand on the slower streets, on the more residential streets in downtown Mobile, are that having a full 10-foot wide travel lane doesn't make sense when you have quite low volume. And in fact, the kind of streets that people want to live on, the most valuable streets in every community, the kind of street I was fortunate enough to grow up on, has travel two-way in an area that's typically 12 to 13 feet wide, but because there's not that much traffic, it functions perfectly well as what's called a shared street or a yield street or a queuing street. And so that model's available to us as well. And you already, this is a typical version of that. This is Washington, D.C., where I lived for quite some time, a yield street. This is a Dearborn Street in already, parts of Dearborn Street are one way, but this part of Dearborn Street, north of Canal, is currently two-way and adheres completely to this model. And I always showed this slide because it's the one image of my brother's car in this show, and support your symphony. So that's a great model. And here's what it looks like. And Allison and I struggled a lot over the graphics of this drawing, because if you don't know the street, in theory, this doesn't work, right? In theory, having a 12-foot zone that's handling traffic in two directions seems like a crazy idea. And that's what the engineers thought for a long time. Even though it's been in the Ashto Green Book, the engineering manual, nonstop, page 436, for 50 years, the yield street, a lot of people, it doesn't make sense to them. But what happens, of course, is that the parking isn't that thick and you're able to duck and weave in between parked cars. And it's precisely this sense of friction that makes the street a safe street. And so that's a model we need to use. Dearborn enjoys it. Monroe Street, in the same neighborhood against Canal, enjoys it. But then let's look then at some of the examples of where we're violating these rules. In terms of the 10-foot lane, Congress Street, for example, here's a section of Congress that's 3 lanes wide, so it should be 30 feet wide. Well, it's got an extra 15 feet in it. Here's St. Joseph, which has parking on both sides, should be about 36 feet wide. It's about 45 feet wide. Here's St. Anthony, has an extra 5 or 8 feet in it. Washington, this is 2 lanes, no parking, should be 20 feet. It's 30 feet, right? This is money in the bank, things we can use for other things. Claiborne, these lanes are about 15 feet wide, south of Government Street. St. Louis Street, interestingly, and we believe we've influenced this, is currently being rebuilt quite nicely, but with a 12-foot standard. So this street that should be 8, 10, 10, 8 is 8, 12, 12, 8. And so we're recommending that it be continued to be built in the same fashion, but with a proper 20-foot zone between the curb cuts and not a 24-foot zone between the curb bulbs at the crossings. Then you've got 2 different types of one-ways that have a little bit of extra space in them. You have one-ways with significant traffic, and these are your east-west one-ways, and the ones on the eastern half of your downtown that are kind of more in the heart of your city and don't have the light traffic that makes them the proper residential yield flow queuing street like you would find in Dearborn. In a street like this, you've got about 16, 17 feet where you only really need about, and I would say you need about 12, because it's only 1 lane. So 10's a little narrow when you only have 1 lane. So you need at least 10 or 12 feet, at least let's say 12 feet clear here in order, but you don't need 16 or 17 feet. Conti is the same circumstance. You can see some parking here that no one's parking, but it's got that extra width. Conception, same thing, just a little bit extra width. Claiborne as well. Then, and also Franklin when it's in the more, actually, sorry. Now we're changing to a different type. Now we're changing to the Dearborn type of street. So there's a bunch of streets now, unlike this one in the heart of downtown, that are further west or that are further north, right? North of the downtown core where things get quieter, to the northwest, to the west, and to the southwest. In those more quiet residential neighborhoods, you have these one-way streets that do not have significant traffic. So they are Franklin, Hamilton, Lawrence, Cedar, Warren, Dearborn, as we already mentioned, Scott, Bayou, Jefferson. These are streets that have lighter traffic and have the potential then to be remade like Dearborn as a two-way street without changing anything except allowing traffic to go in both directions on those streets. And we'll talk more about that. Third, one-way streets. It turns out, it took a while for us to figure this out, but it turns out that one-way streets are more dangerous than two-way streets. But especially, and actually I need to be very precise, multi-lane one-way streets are more dangerous than two-way streets. When you have more than one lane going in the same direction, you create the opportunity to jockey. You have another lane that, right, always seems faster than the lane you're in. You have the ability to pass. You have the momentum of all that flow in the same direction, right? The sheer momentum of two lanes of traffic moving. And generally the data shows quite clearly that when you convert a one-way street that's multi-lane into a two-way street, it becomes safer, it becomes more comfortable, and importantly, it becomes more successful for business as well. For some time now, the city has been studying converting St. Joseph to two-way traffic, and that is on its way. I've worked in a whole bunch of different communities where we've done this. This is New Albany, Indiana, where the neighbors clamored for it. And we did a plan there, even more extreme perhaps than what we're going to be proposing here in Mobile, to convert an entirely one-way grid to two-way traffic. The city hemmed and hawed over it for about 3 years, and then one summer, well, actually what they did was they did a bunch of studies that turned out to be unnecessary to give themselves comfort. And then in one summer, they did this entire thing. And the folks who were worried about it, like the police chief, are actually the biggest boosters for this plan. The police chief says he's never seen a better scenario for public safety. Speeds have been reduced, crashes are down, and response time to calls for service is far better than it's ever been. I have separate testimonials that are in the plan that discuss how it's really helped business as well. From my book, Walkable City Rules, this is a list of, as of 2 years ago, all the cities I could find that had done significant transformation of one-way streets in their downtown to two-way streets. Every single one of these transformations has been celebrated. There's never been a oops, there's never been a return, there's never been anyone saying we have too much traffic or this is a mistake, because they always work. Now, we don't recommend it for every street in every city, but there's the fears that people have never seem to materialize about what's going to happen when you, and we say revert, not convert, because when you revert these streets back to the two-way traffic that they once enjoyed. So you're really just returning them to their original state. The condition then in downtown is that you have a couple larger streets, St. Joseph, which is already headed towards two-way travel, and St. Anthony, which is the other major street that we're recommending for two-way travel. The remainder of these streets are these delicate little neighborhood streets that we already described as having a little extra room in them and being similar, for example, to Monroe or to this piece of Dearborn that are already two-way, but simply maintain their one-way travel. So going through them, St. Joseph already being converted, St. Anthony, we recommend the plan that you see it right, where you have 19 feet, which is a nice slow width for travel in two directions, parallel parking on the side. It'll be a nice, calmly traveled street and two-way travel. Then that's St. Anthony. Then looking at all of these delicate, I forgot to mention the other big one that we're not changing, which is we seriously considered, everyone thinks about Dauphin all the time. Should it be a pedestrian street? How could it be optimized? It became clear through we were really open to considering everything. It became clear through, what we suspected became clear through these conversations, which is that Dauphin really does thrive with slow moving traffic on it, and certainly with cars parking on it, which the businesses really cherish. So we wanted to maintain that flow, but we also wanted to maintain the parking. So the idea of putting two-way onto Dauphin, which is not possible on the eastern half where it's skinny, but on the western half would mean that we could never have parking on this flank, on the northern flank. And we'll talk about that in a minute, but we concluded that it was more important to have parking on both sides of Dauphin than to have two-way travel on Dauphin. So we did not make the choice to introduce two-way travel to Dauphin. What we did, however, want to do is to give this quality, which honestly, particularly in the South, I mean, you find it all over America, but particularly in the South, the classic cities like Savannah and Charleston and Mobile, they have these great slow speed streets that are the best, most livable, most walkable neighborhoods in the city. And there's no reason why you can't have the same benefit on all these other streets: Hamilton, Lawrence, Cedar, the rest of Dearborn, Eslava, Scott, Bayou, and Jefferson. And so that's what we're proposing. There's some glitches in this map, which have to do mostly with signalization and the limitations to changing signalization on Government Street. And then there's some other reasons we haven't done it in order to have bike lanes, which I'll describe. But you can see that with the exception of Washington, which is already two-way, all of these streets with a few other little gaps are proposed for two-way travel. And we're very confident will thrive as yield flow queuing streets, just like Monroe and Dearborn are currently organized. So that's one-way streets. Now, continuous on-street parking. I've been talking a long time about how in America, at least, where people drive and people drive pretty quickly, curb parking, parallel parking or angle parking, but some sort of parking along the curb is an essential barrier of steel that protects the sidewalk from moving vehicles. It's very rare to find a main street that succeeds without parking along it in the US. I had been saying that for years when I arrived in Fort Lauderdale to do a downtown walkability study and discovered this street at happy hour, which Himarshi Boulevard, a key happy hour street, which you were allowed to park on the south side of the street, but you weren't allowed to park on the north side of the street. And this on the left is happy hour on the south side, and on the right is happy hour on the north side, because no one wants to walk, to sit, right, or dine, or walk, or be on a curb where cars are speeding past you quickly. And that's just a fact of life in our cities. And so there are opportunities throughout your certain of your streets in your downtown that have extra lanes. It seemed to us through this very careful analysis that the best solution for them was to add more parallel parking. And essentially, when you have extra space in a street, the choice you face principally is, if you're just going to use paint and you're not going to widen the street by expensively building the curb, the choice you have is, do we put parallel parking in, or do we put bike facilities in, or both? And a few streets give you the opportunity for both, but most streets you have to make a choice. You'll see how we've tried to develop, a couple steps ahead, we've tried to develop a really rational bicycle network for downtown, but you don't need bikes on every street. And there's a lot of streets that would really benefit from having permanent parallel parking along them. And in fact, you could argue that these streets have been stunted. Their growth has been limited by the fact that they don't have parallel parking along them. One of those certainly is MLK, which people park illegally along, but there's no reason why these extra driving lanes could not be permanent parking lanes. So that's what we're recommending. And then you have the main stretch of Washington, really north of Spring Hill, which is this 30-foot street that could be a 20-foot street. So actually, we're making the parking as wide as we can, 9 feet, which is a foot extra, giving you an extra foot still, but much safer and more normal width for your driving lanes. So that's our recommendation for Washington. St. Joseph is being converted to two-way travel from one-way, but it also has an extra 10 feet in it. When you have an extra 10 feet in a street, what you can do is tremendously increase your supply of parking downtown by making one side of that street angle parking. So what you see here in this extra space, and we worked on a street in Tulsa that had the exact same dimension, that was a newly built street that functioned perfectly well with angle parking on one side and parallel parking on the other. And so that's what we're proposing for this stretch of St. Joseph, which will significantly increase the amount of parking right near the heart of downtown. And then there's Dauphin. Dauphin has this condition, many of you are probably aware of it, where west of Claiborne, it's 2 lanes. East of Claiborne, it's 1 lane. That's because it narrows at Claiborne. In this western area, you are allowed to park overnight, but you are not allowed to park during the day. And you're allowed to park on this flank, the southern flank, but you're not allowed to park on the northern flank. And I think it's very interesting and very clear that from Claiborne west are those locations where, because it's a 2-lane one-way, you have a greater number of injury accidents. You might, because of happy hour and all the partying, I wouldn't be surprised if there are more fender benders on the eastern half. But in terms of higher speed injury collisions, you can see that it's worse towards the west. And in fact, it transforms at Claiborne when it becomes a 1-lane street. And here you have this condition of these benches, where these, God bless these merchants who actually think someone's going to sit on that bench and grab a lunch while cars are zipping by at 40 miles an hour. Just 4 feet away. So the concern there, and it's a legitimate concern, it's a life safety concern, is that fire trucks need to fit. And when the fire truck sets up and puts out its stabilizer, and by the way, there's only 1 stabilizer on your fire trucks, which is an improvement over many cities, 14-inch wide stabilizer. When it puts down its stabilizer, the truck is actually, at that location, it's 18 feet wide. And what you have here, if you park on both sides, is only about 14 feet. So this has been the impediment to having permanent around-the-clock parking on both sides of Dauphin Street. We really feel that the lack of parking on both sides of Dauphin, both in terms of safety, but more so in terms of just vitality, is the principal, if I had to pick one thing, the principal thing that's holding you back in terms of your downtown reaching the next level and going from being a somewhat regional tourist destination to more of a national tourist destination. It's having the kind of quality of life, protected sidewalks, and activity that would come from parking both sides of this street. So, we're very concerned about life safety issues, and we have a compromise proposal that we think should be considered. Honestly, if you look at the data, I feel the best solution is just continuous parking. But there's another solution in which the parking spaces could be located, and this is flipped, so you need to do a mirror image of this to match the drawing. You already have a continuous parking lane on the southern edge, and that's what's shown here. On the northern edge, we recommend a solution that periodically, maybe not between every space, but it would be fine if it was between every space, you have a 3-foot zone, right? Wider than the 14-inch stabilizer, so that if you needed to park the car, park the fire truck, that's a location where every 20 or 40 feet or so, you could insert the stabilizer. Obviously, I don't want to be naive about it. That requires a little more care in parking the truck, and we don't mess with life safety. So I want to say, life safety is important, but life safety really has to do with the risk of injury from fire and the risk of injury from car crashes. We know what the car crash injuries are on this street. I do not have any information about fire injuries on this street. I do not believe, and I don't want to make light of fire. I take fire very seriously. I do not want to make light of that risk. However, I do want to tell you this. Nationally, car crash injuries outrank building fire injuries by a ratio of 180 to 1. And so in our conversations with the city, I've been very forthright about saying we need to think not about fire safety as a silo. We need to think about life safety. How many people are living, dying, being injured or not in your downtown? I feel pretty confident saying that the risk caused by a slightly slower fire response is statistically insignificant compared to the people who are getting injured every year on this street from cars driving too quickly. And so as someone who has, no dog in this fight, who just wants the safest downtown possible, but understands that fire is one of many risks, I'm advocating for a solution that puts parking back on the other side of Dauphin. I think we've waited far too long for it, and it's really held your downtown back. So I'm recommending this solution. Now, number 5, a useful bike network. People get frustrated in cities. This is Portland, where people aren't frustrated. And Portland's one of many cities. For a while, it was the poster child, but now, of course, we could point to so many different places where they've invested in bicycle infrastructure and they've changed people's habits. People get frustrated because it doesn't happen with just a few bike lanes. And that's why I say a useful bike network. Until you create a network that actually gets you where you need to go and makes travel through the downtown a safe prospect for people who are maybe a little bit timid about risking their lives on a cycle, then you will not generate that population. And so the question is, when do you cross that threshold, and how can you be confident that you've done it? Now, we're quite aware, and we've been reminded many times, not many people bike in downtown Mobile. That is a function of the inadequate bicycle facilities in downtown Mobile. And I have to say that you've been making great strides, and the enthusiasm is certainly there, and bike share is a part of achieving that. The amazing plan for Broad Street includes this gold standard of this separated bicycle facility out of the street that's going to make a really big difference. It's particularly distinct from this. I have to say, Alyson and I will not do these anymore. We will do in-street bike lanes, what's called an integrated lane, not separated from traffic, but not in the door zone. The door zone is really no place for a bike lane, and we don't have to do it anymore, so we don't do it. This is still the standard in many cities, and the good news is that you're in a position where you have so few bike lanes that the ones that you add can actually meet the current standard of not being in the door zone. So this is the proposed bike network that comes out of this plan. I have to say, it comes out of so many different factors that all feed into decision-making. One of them is trying to have it be useful. But a second one that in some ways motivates changes that wouldn't be necessary is to use up extra street space. Any extra space in a street that we can use up with a bike lane is going to cause drivers to drive at a safer speed through your downtown. So there's actually lanes proposed here that you might not even need to get that sense of safety through your downtown. But what this is we don't put the bike lanes where we feel the space is needed for parallel parking, and we don't put the bike lanes where they don't fit, but we find the spaces with the extra pavement where bike lanes are possible. So let me take you through the different components of this plan. The first part is the Henry Aaron Loop. Currently, you've got great bike lanes going in on Broad and Beauregard. You've got nice bike lanes, except for the lack of protection on Water Street and Canal Street. And then you have a missing gap here to the southeast. Broad Street we talked about, it's going to be excellent. And this is the plan. You can see the out of street bicycle lane. Water Street, the original plan for Water had vertical separation in the buffer zone. As this sits now, it's basically a bike lane and a highway. I'm a very comfortable cyclist. I would not cycle here. I know you have cyclists who do, bless them, but this is not a bike lane that's going to attract folks until it has vertical protection in it that makes it truly feel safe as well as to be safe. I understand that there's been various legal conversations about perceived impediments to this. All I can say is it's not a state road. It's a downtown. It's a city road, and those legal impediments have certainly been overcome in most other cities. So I believe there might be an interpretation happening that is overly strict as to what's possible. Putting individual planters in the street, in the buffer zone, with some space in between them, is the clear and easy solution, inexpensive solution. However, this may require an additional investment. It was brought to our attention, of course, that keeping these lanes clean, particularly in Mobile, is really a challenge. And so you may need to acquire a skinny street sweeper to specifically just sweep your bike lanes. And it's certainly worth the investment to have a cycling population. So the plans for Water and for Canal as well are the existing plans, but with these little logos here that suggest the presence of planters being dropped in those buffer zones, which will also cause the drivers and the cars to go a bit slower. Canal Street, same thing, existing plan. We don't feel that there's a demand for parking here, so we didn't add parking to it, but we did suggest planters going in the bike lanes, going in the bike buffers, as you see there. But what's missing is this connector here between essentially government and Claiborne. And what you have there are these multi-lane one-ways that are designed like highways because they're along the highway, but actually they're not highways, and they're not carrying much traffic at all. So in these, you have the opportunity, an extra space to use up, to have a bike lane. This varies through the section, and this section gets wider and narrower through different parts of it. This drawing may not apply to this exact location, but based on the width of the street, you either have a buffered bike lane, a bike lane with no buffer, but up against moving traffic, and parking, or all three of those things. Now, people do park, as you can see, under the overpass and elsewhere along here in order to access the cruise terminal. It isn't parked in all the time. I don't mind if you stripe it and no one uses it, but the point is to create a single driving lane and encourage slower speeds, and also to welcome bikes. You know, bikes against one lane will feel much safer than against two lanes in this location. So that's the general solution for both north and south stretches through this area that gets you the full circle. Then we have Washington Street. If you look from the north and south, you have Washington Street. A lot of people come to downtown, and some of them on bikes from the south. Not so many from the north, because if you look at the population distribution, it's mostly west and south, right? The western area will be handled by Broad Street, where people can go north and south and transfer to east-west trajectories. From the south, almost all of them are coming in on Washington, particularly because all these other streets have been stubbed out up against Canal. So Washington is the most important north-south corridor, and it connects to Spring Hill, which we've already described as having extra space in it. So this segment of Washington, where you have 3 lanes, it only needs to be 2, can fit bike lanes and driving lanes. And they're there's perfect room for them next to each other. Additionally, it gets narrower in some places. And in those narrower places, it's important to understand that this was a struggle. I did the multimodal plan for University of Alabama. And it took them a while to learn that a piece of paint is not a wall. But in terms of the width of your lanes and the ability to fit cars and buses and other vehicles on your streets, the paint along the bike lane is there to encourage folks to stay in the middle and drive a little more slowly, and to stay away from the cyclists when they're in the lane, right? But when there's no cyclist there is plenty of elbow room for passing another vehicle so that you don't have to worry about it being too tight. And so some of these streets become narrower, become 18 feet or narrower, understanding there's extra give in the bike lane. Spring Hill, we mentioned, has a ton of room in it, as well as parallel parking. And here's where we're suggesting the same example that I showed you in Cedar Rapids, where the bike lanes pull off the curb and we create what's called a cycle track protected bike lanes along the curb on both edges, just like that, because there's room for it. And then we've already been working with your engineering department to make sure this intersection where it meets St. Louis and Broad and has these bulb outs that currently get in the way, that is being or has been reconstructed to allow for through bike motion on the corners so that this solution works in that location. And that was kind of an on-the-fly thing we did during the workshop. So that's this north-south corridor. Secondarily, that kind of handles the west part of downtown. What about the east part of downtown? Well, there's Claiborne, which has extra room in it, and Lawrence, in which the residents, to fight speeding on their street, they didn't want a two-way street. They wanted a bike lane. So we thought, perfect, because there's a pair. Because Claiborne is a southbound street. Lawrence then provides the northbound pair. So now you have a south and north pair in that location. Claiborne, the lanes are so wide that you can put in a bike lane and expand the parking lane and still have 10-foot driving lanes on Claiborne, south of Government. And so depending on the width of the street in different locations, it will keep a bike lane and sometimes have 2 lanes, sometimes have 1. And it changes, it's quite a long street with many different dimensions. Many of our street sections in the second part of the plan are 3, 4, 5 pages long to handle all the different conditions that you find along your different streets. And then you have Lawrence again with an extra, an extra lot of feet in the street that allows the parking to remain. And then up against the wall here, you can insert a bike lane as well. So that's that pair there. And then you have all of these streets we mentioned, your downtown north-south streets, actually some are east-west, we'll talk about them, but these one-way streets that should not be two-way streets because they have too much travel, but they've still got an extra 5 feet or 4 feet or something in them that makes them too wide. So here, for example, on Conception, there's, without changing anything, you just stick a bike lane in the road next to the cars. And notice, again, this would be a mirror image to match this picture. Notice it's not in the door zone. It's almost always on the other side of the street. And notice it's just paint. It's not a wall. So the experience driving is no more constricted except visually. And that visual constriction will cause safer driving. Similarly on Joachim, similarly on Claiborne, similarly on Franklin. Then other north-south streets, you have Lawrence, which comes in super wide as a 6-laner from the north. Again, another highway condition that never occurred. There we have room to add parking protected bike lanes like we suggested for Spring Hill. That's up in here. And then Congress, we're doing north-south streets. So then you have St. Michael. And St. Michael now we're switching to east-west. That was the end of the north-south. Now we're switching east-west. You have this condition in St. Michael, St. Francis, and Conti, which is similar to what we saw in Conception, Joachim, Claiborne, and Franklin. And by the way, why not every street? Well, not every street needs a bike lane, but also it so happens Jackson has parking on both sides. And so we would have to eliminate parking to put a bike lane in there. So no reason to do that, right? So now heading to the east-west streets. St. Michael is another of these streets that has so much extra room in it, we can actually put a buffer up against the bike lane and keep the parking. Conti, add a bike lane. So that's this pair, St. Michael and Conti. And then St. Francis is a little bit different because it's two-way and it's a little bit narrower. And you'll notice this is less than 20 feet. It's only 17 feet. This is what we call a slow street. It's not as narrow as a yield street. 2 cars can pass, but a car and a bus, not so easily, if it wasn't for the elbow room provided by the bike lane. So, cars are 6 feet wide, buses are 8.5 feet wide. When they pass each other, I wouldn't do this in 17 feet if the bike lane weren't there. Clearly, if there's a bike in the picture, people will exercise more caution, but this is a street that could take a bike lane just to make it a narrower driving area and to allow an additional street that is the opposite direction of St. Michael. So if you take St. Michael east, yes, you can go all the way down to Conti to go west, but you could also go west on St. Francis. So that's that. And then finally, coming in from the northwest, Congress Street is quite huge. It's a 4-laner. You can see this gentleman has anticipated our bike lane, which we're proposing for the eastern 2 lanes. And it gets complicated because it's a quite wide street, and then it narrows, and then it narrows quite a bit. And so what we're suggesting is that the eastbound bike lane, there's room for it to stay in Congress. So the eastbound bike lane would start at Royal, or really at Water, and keep going all the way across. But the westbound bike lane would start at Water and go all the way across. But the eastbound bike lane would take Congress Street and then use the Claiborne pair, right, to the Claiborne-Franklin pair to transition on Claiborne over to State Street. Now, we had meetings with every neighborhood, and the folks in this neighborhood were very forthright in saying cars are driving too fast on Congress Street and cars are driving too fast on State Street. And we said, well, then we should introduce these slow flow geometrics, the 17-foot shared lane, but we can give you parking or we can give you bike lanes. Now, parking would be a little tight, right? Because then you'd have really no give. You'd have 16 feet constricted by doors on car doors on both sides. That seemed a little tight, but also the residents said very clearly, we don't need more parking. We'd like the bike lanes. So the bike lane that comes in on both sides of Congress, right, splits at Claiborne and Franklin, as you see here, and then half of it goes into State Street and half of it remains in Congress Street. And in both cases, you have a slow flow but ample 2-way travel zone, and you have a bike lane without any physical protection, so that if a car and a bus or 2 trucks happen to be passing each other, there's just as much elbow room in the street as there was before, but the street currently lacks the visual constraint that would cause people to go more slowly. So that's that part. Now, I do want to bring this up. A lot of people talk about cycling as this elitist activity. I think if you look around Mobile at who's cycling, but certainly if you look around the country at who's cycling and who ends up cycling when you provide ample bike facilities, it's the furthest thing from an elite investment you could make. Fully 39% of the people who commute on bicycles in the US come from the poorest 25% of the population. And so this is something you can do to help with equity and to make Mobile a city that works for everyone. I apologize, the bike part is always the longest part and always the most complicated part. The remaining parts are all shorter and simpler. Interesting thing about center lines. We only discovered this a few years ago. A study was done in London. We welcome more studies. Certainly people's experience in our communities has supported this anecdotally. When you remove the center line from a street, on average, people's speeds drop 7 miles an hour. Why? Well, it's a little confusing, but in fact, the center line is something that makes you know that no one's going to hit you. So without the center line, drivers are more cautious. And so our standard, unless we're making high speed, super high volume streets, is to remove center lines from your streets. So I showed you Congress before and after. I showed you a whole bunch of streets you might have noticed in this talk that have no center line in them. There's a reason for that, and we think these streets will be safer without center lines. Additionally, you'll notice the parking isn't striped here, which is okay if there's no one, if there are people parking. But if there's nobody parking, then actually having the stripe in the street communicates that visual constraint in a way that slows drivers down. And so striping the parking lanes instead of the center line is something that slows traffic. I wanted to add one more thing, which is you all are concerned, folks at the city are concerned, and we are concerned that when you convert a street, when you revert a street from one-way travel to two-way travel, that people shouldn't be confused about that fact. And having no center line can be confusing. So we do recommend that for your one-ways that are converted to two-way, like St. Joseph and St. Anthony, that for 25 or 50 feet from the intersection, you stripe the center lane, but then you stop it. So the middle of the block has no center line in it. Swooping geometries. People understand the vocabulary of the spaces that they're in. If a place is designed for automobiles, they feel it and they speed up. This is the famously unsuccessful or somewhat successful addition to the Strip in Las Vegas, and the Truth in the Truth in Journalism article. Some say the entrance to City Center is not inviting to pedestrians, because when you have all of these kind of aerodynamic shapes, right, slip form geometrics, they communicate the vocabulary of the automobile and not of the pedestrian. But more importantly, they actually encourage speeding and they enable speeding. And one of the key enablers of speeding is the classic slip lane, where you can avoid stopping at the light and actually have an unsignalized intersection at the corner, which you can swoop around, like here in Atlanta. And Atlanta is a city that's taken bold measures, particularly in Midtown, to become more walkable. And so they've been closing their slip lanes, and more cities are closing their slip lanes. Here in Mobile, you have just a few, you have more than a few, but you have a few where pedestrians are going with frequency. The most important one probably is where Dauphin terminates on Water Street. It's interesting to know that, it's important to know that sometimes these are introduced so that trucks can turn the corner. In this case, when you have a wide receiving street, this is 35 feet across. When you have a wide receiving street, trucks can easily turn the corner into the far lane and then curve back into the other lane if they want to be there. So this slip lane is serving absolutely no purpose except to encourage these drivers to speed around the corner, not obey the signal, and endanger the pedestrians who are crossing in this location. So we recommend that slip lane is closed immediately. There's another slip lane at St. Louis. There aren't many pedestrians crossing here. However, oh wait, let me make sure. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. No, this is Dauphin again. This is the same location I showed you before. I just wanted to keep this picture in the show to congratulate you that it was worse, right? Here, not that long ago, there weren't even crossings in this location. So progress is always being made. I don't want to ignore that. Now at St. Louis, there aren't that many pedestrians, but there are some, and you have the condition where St. Louis is being rebuilt. So as the street is being rebuilt and you have ample width for the turn, there's no need for this slip lane, particularly a two-lane slip lane, to continue to exist. And so this can be closed and should be closed with curb as part of that reconstruction. Then you have the worst intersection, not statistically, but perceptually in all of downtown. And that's where Beauregard meets Water, meets the interstate. And this segment of the street and points west is being rebuilt as part of the Broad Street reconstruction. Until it is rebuilt, it has the same problem of an unprotected bike lane up against a highway, but vertical protection or out-of-street bike lane will solve that problem. Nothing will really solve the problem of this intersection, though, with these slip lanes in it. And so we worked with the engineers at, and there's an opportunity, which is that it's currently under consideration for restriping and moving forward with a plan that we took and doctored for restriping the street, maintaining the slip lanes and the swoopy intersections. So the engineers at Nelson Nygaard worked on it. We came up with an alternate plan, which we've submitted to the city. We've made sure the truck turning motions work at this corner and that corner. We've removed the slip lanes. We've shortened the crossing distances, and we have introduced bicycle, because this is a bicycle friendly street when it's done, and this is Water with its bike lanes on either side. Introduce bicycle crossings as well to this intersection as part of this proposal. This also has been submitted some time ago to the city. Then there's little mistakes, like someone decided at a certain point that the southbound entrance from Government Street onto Jefferson Street next to the supermarket would be designed like a highway on-ramp. Why? We're not sure why. This is the sort of things that engineers who are used to designing highways when active in city centers just kind of do without thinking about it, and completely undermine the ability of a pedestrian to get from here to here, right? This sort of thing certainly isn't being done by your engineering department now in the downtown, but there are opportunities to fix them. This is a good opportunity that needs to be fixed. Perhaps a more important one, because it's such a key location and a place where a lot of cruise ship passengers are walking under the highway through this gateway to and from the cruise ship terminals and other things on Monroe Street, where it crosses Royal and then crosses the frontage roads of Water along the highway. You can see it's just super swoopy, right? So at a certain point, this was engineered because it's alongside a highway. It was engineered with the high speed, 50-mile-an-hour turn radiuses. Okay, honestly, 30 mile an hour, but who wants to take a turn at 30 if you're not on a highway? Slip lanes. And so this seemed like enough of an opportunity. And also, this street is almost 30 feet wide. So it's 2 lanes, almost 15 feet wide. And then inadequate, faded crossings to the waterfront at this intersection. Extra width in the street, not serving much of a purpose here. And we already described the extra lane present in the frontage roads, northbound connecting to Water Street and southbound connecting to Water. Additionally, this street, Royal, north of the intersection, it's wide enough for parking on both sides, but parking is only allowed on one side. Here it's wide enough for parking on one side, parking isn't allowed at all. So we took it upon ourselves to redesign this whole segment. And you see a whole bunch of changes here. The first thing you see is the parking on Royal Street being introduced to both sides, or one side as appropriate. You see the bike lanes and parking being introduced to these very wide 2-lane streets on either side of the highway. You see the highway, you see the street underneath being given 10-foot lanes, so parking now fits, and the center line being removed away from the intersection. And you see the slip lane and extra swoopy curves being repainted, and there's a certain kind of epoxy gravel surface that you can use to extend curves. We've added parking, we've removed the slip lane, and this is a similar, temporary project. It happens to be from Chicago, but you can see how with paint and surface decals and other things, you can, in an inexpensive way, without changing any of the drainage, you can create a more urban condition. So to encourage comfort walking through this area, as well as safety. One other point, this is your gateway, one of several, but a very important gateway to downtown. If there's any place in your, I love this, Dauphin Street's a 10-minute walk, that's very encouraging. If there was ever a place to invest in a more emphatic public art solution, like we find in some other cities on their underpasses, this would be a great place to do that. So we couldn't help but mention that as well. Few sidewalk curb cuts. This is the shortest conversation because unlike other places, you have very few places that suffer from this. The principal one is here on North Joachim, where you have all these little parking lots, that are connected to each other, but because they're individual properties, they all get curb cuts. And of course, the curb cuts cross the sidewalk in such a way that there's no sidewalk. So when you're allowing this to happen, you're eroding the sense of comfort and safety along the sidewalk. This brief mention of this challenge is to say, okay, where there is no curb cut, there could at least be a curb, right? Whenever you rebuild this street, that's an important thing to do. And then secondarily, we actually introduced in Tulsa a program for consolidating curb cuts, getting rid of extra curb cuts, having the transition between the lanes of the parking happen in the parking lot and not in the street, that allows for a healthier sidewalk edge. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Okay, this is the other big topic, which is no traffic signals that could be all-way stops. Interestingly enough, when you replace a traffic signal with an always stop sign, crashes drop dramatically, and injury crashes drop dramatically, and pedestrian injury crashes drop the most of all. This is the major study that was done. There's been lots of evidence since, but the transition of intersections that don't need signals, and there's a very clear determination of when a signal is warranted in an intersection. When an intersection actually doesn't need a signal, if you transition that signal to an always stop sign, you make it a much more, a much safer place. And I want to say that the reasons for this are pretty obvious if you think about it. The first thing is that in an always stop intersection, unlike a signalized intersection, no one who's obeying the law is ever driving through it at more than, say, 5 miles an hour. Now, people may do rolling stops. They may not stop fully. None of us really do. But the fact is that they've never got a green light that's causing them to go 20, 30, 40 miles an hour. Secondly, they're never trying to beat the light. And you have a condition where you see the light's yellow, of course, and you run it, and that's the cause of a lot of collisions and injuries. Thirdly, there's a ton of visual communication that happens. Everyone's looking at everyone else. There's some uncertainty. Uncertainty is a real help to safety. A lot of uncertainty. Who goes next? Drivers look at each other. Drivers look at pedestrians. The pedestrians are almost always waved through. The cyclists tend to blow through if it's safe. That's annoying, but in fact, it's a safer outcome than what often happens in many signalized intersections. So what we do is we look at your downtown signals. I want everyone to memorize this. Okay, you got it? And then you say, okay, which ones of these signals? And what you see in green, in red, you have a number of always stop signs that happen to be signalized. And those can be kept, but it's better to have them just as always stops, just because it looks less highway-like, right? Secondly, you have within, not on Government Street, not on Water Street, not on Broad Street or Beauregard, you have, or Canal, you have 21 signals, none of which has enough traffic that it would warrant today. If you were to look at it and study it and say, do we need to put a signal here? None of them would warrant a signal. And we contend that they can all lose their signals. This is downtown Albuquerque, where my study recommended 17 signals be converted to always stop signs. They converted 11 of them. It's just an interesting story. They converted 11 of them. They got complaints, so they reverted a couple of them back. When they reverted them back, they got even more complaints, because what was really interesting was traffic flows more smoothly, and there's data suggesting this from the highway engineers. Traffic flows more smoothly when you have always stops rather than signals. And you notice here, city reinstalls downtown stop signs to reduce not just speeding, but the traffic pile up. Because if you think about it, yes, you have to stop at many corners, but you're never sitting. You're never sitting and waiting for a light to change. So it's actually a more efficient system. And so it worked out in Albuquerque. Here are your existing controls, and here's our proposal. And there's too much here to get into all of it, but all of these reds, these 21 reds, are signals that we believe should be always stops. Now let me add to say, and I neglected to mention, a number of your signals downtown, the reason that they are warranted, that they should exist now, is because they're on multi-lane one-way streets. And a multi-lane one-way street is very hard to negotiate with an always stop, because then not only do you have people coming from different directions, but you've got people next to you in other lanes, so the confusion about who goes first is even greater. When you revert the multi-lane one-ways to two-way travel, that eliminates the few signals that are warranted in the downtown. And so 21 signals can be converted to stop signs in conjunction with the reversion, particularly of St. Joseph and St. Anthony, to two-way travel. And this is heaven, right? This is the good city. This happens to be in Oregon, but never mind. This, I think, is Eugene. I forget. I've visited so many places where, yes, the streetscape is lovely, but the combination of the stop signs and the tight geometries make everyone feel welcome, cars, as drivers as well, even people kind of going in the wrong direction feel comfortable. Then finally, the last item on our list, proper crosswalks and beacons, particularly crosswalks. It's pretty obvious, but what's not so obvious perhaps is some of the places where we need them, where they don't exist or they're not being built. Crosswalks can be really special. I like to show this image of Iceland just to introduce the topic, but this has nothing to do with what we're doing here. One area where we're quite concerned, which is not yet resolved, but the plan has a very clear recommendation, is for the crossing here at Broad, which many pedestrians of Conti Street, many pedestrians and cyclists can be observed crossing this street, or at least could be before the reconstruction. And there wasn't much of a barrier, a sense of impediment to crossing. With the reconstruction and the raised median and all, it's kind of making permanent the unwelcomeness, the non-visibility, and the kind of danger that will be posed to cyclists and pedestrians crossing Broad on Conti. And the fact is, they're going to keep doing it. You can't stop them from doing it. And if they're going to keep doing it, the question is, what's an outcome that would cause fewer of them to be threatened or potentially injured? So we proposed a solution that puts an island in the center here and shortens this turn lane. And it's written up in the appendix of our report, the arguments for it. The turn lane is quite long, and it has to reach all the way down to Government, because the signal the signal at Broad and Government is extremely heavily trafficked. And so there are a lot of cars that back up along this corridor. In fact, the changes currently underway at that intersection are changing what was a double left-hand turn lane to a single left-hand turn lane, which is going to cause considerable backup along this lane. Our calculations show that shortening that lane will only have a minimal impact on what's going to be a big backup there anyway, if you don't introduce that second lane of turning traffic. And so we feel that for safety, even though it does undermine slightly the traffic performance of the street, we feel that some sort of solution here, maybe a different one, but some sort of solution that has crosswalks and welcomes the pedestrians doing what they're going to do anyway across Broad at Conti is really important. That is unresolved. Also unresolved, and I think such an easy fix, and perhaps a emblematic example of inertia that causes things to not happen as quickly as people might like, which, by the way, is normal in every city, and it's a struggle that every city has, and there are reasons why things take a long time, but certainly there's no reason why Conti, which is like dozens of blocks long and terminates at your Renaissance Hotel, and lots of people are walking to and from the hotel east-west, does not have crosswalks, or at least doesn't have one crosswalk on one side of the street, avoiding the drive-through of the hotel. This is really important. And so here's where I just kind of take the bully pulpit that I have tonight and say, come on, like this is the kind of thing that should have been done already. And let's get that done quickly. It also should have some sort of flashing beacon or something that calls drivers' attention to pedestrians crossing there. We didn't notice these. I think if we'd been there, we probably would have tripped on them. But a number of residents called our attention to what I think is the newer standard for curbs in the downtown versus the older standard. And a lot of people are tripping on these. We haven't seen these in other cities. We're not sure where you got them, but we're advocating that you go back to the old standard of a complete ramp as opposed to a trip hazard corner. I'm sure there's a good engineering reason why this was introduced, but we're advocating returning to the other way. And then finally, I've managed to avoid it until now because in certain ways it just seems hopeless. But we've come this far in the study, and we haven't addressed Government Street. And, you know, if you want to have the biggest impact, you know, figuratively, not literally, go to where the impacts are, go to where the collisions are, go to where the injuries are. And I'm sure there are deaths here as well. You know, Government Street is the biggest problem in your downtown because it's the highway that runs through your downtown. You know, it's owned by AlDOT. They have a mandate of bringing a lot of traffic through it, and it's an incredible workhorse that serves your city well in terms of getting traffic not only to the downtown, but mostly through the downtown and east-west, you know, through this whole region. But it is still, you know, I mean, Dauphin may be your kind of entertainment main street, but Government is your commercial main street. It's the heart of your community in a commercial way. And it's actually just not crossable. It's very rare for us, I think Allison would back me up, it's very rare for us to come to a city in which streets dead end effectively for pedestrians at a major main street without crossings. Like, you're actually in a condition here where if you come down Hamilton, you need to go 200 feet east or 200 feet west to cross the street. And of course, people don't do that. They don't make that choice. You also have a lot of crossings. You have two conditions. The worst condition is just no signal and no crossing. Now, you may not want to gum up in fact, I can say with some confidence, you don't want to gum up your vehicular flow with these very lightly traveled streets probably by having a signal for cross traffic. But what you do want to have is a push button signal or a pedestrian activated signal for pedestrians in this location. Because when pedestrians come from the north to go south or the south to go north, as they do and will do, you can't expect them. And this is the dangerous by design, you know, theme. Most of these deaths that are happening that are causing Florida and Alabama to be the most dangerous states in the country are people who are faced with these intersections where they have to go 200 feet, 400 feet, east or west in order to cross, and they don't make that choice. They choose not to. Here's the second condition where you do have a signal, but you don't have a crosswalk. So here at Washington Street, there might be a crosswalk on the other, I believe there's a crosswalk on the other side of the street. Of course, people take the shortest path. They won't even cross the street to use a crosswalk 40 feet away. So there's a restriping job and there's a resignalization job. Now, it so happens that there's a schedule already attached to Government Street where within a couple of years, within a couple of years, the street's going to be repaved, and that's your opportunity to restripe. Within a couple of years, the signalization is going to be analyzed, and that's your opportunity to change the signals. Honestly, I don't want to be responsible for the injuries and deaths that happen between now and then, and I think you shouldn't wait. But there is a schedule underway that allow you, according to that schedule, to make these changes in your street, to provide the crosswalks that are missing and to provide the pedestrian crossings that are missing, particularly at those streets that don't have signals. Now, you can't help but ignore, and AlDOT and the city have not been ignoring this intersection at Conception Street, where there's been a lot of talk for a number of years about the fact that it's just the most dangerous intersection in downtown. A lot of people are making bad decisions at this intersection. A lot of it has to do with the fact that you know, people are coming out of the tunnel. They're coming out of the tunnel and they're going berserk, and they're like, I don't want to be on this road anymore. And they're trying to turn illegally from the center lanes of the tunnel into the side streets, which they're not allowed to do. And currently, there isn't any real impediment. So these are the surface lanes coming from the east. And these two are the tunnel lanes coming from the east and going east. And you can see these flags that are in the road and the straight ahead arrow. But a lot of people are taking this turn anyway. And previous solutions proposed by the city or by AlDOT haven't found favor among local merchants and others because they kind of snip the intersection. They don't allow the turn in. They don't allow the left turn in, which is very important. They don't allow potentially even these guys to turn right into the intersection. Now, there are, I'm sure, other solutions. And as with anything that we draw, You know, anything you eventually build needs to be drawn and stamped by a local civil engineer who's willing to vouch for it. But I proposed in this location one solution that I think is worth investigating, which is the creation of these curbed islands with bollards in them that would encourage folks to not make crazy moves across the intersection, and which provide protection to this crosswalk going through the intersection. And then secondarily, to take the strip of flags that currently run just to this spot and to extend them to the point where they're not impeding the left turn, but almost impeding the left turn. And therefore creating a condition where you'd have to be out of your mind to try and make this turn when you come out of the tunnel. This is just, you know, like many of these drawings, I'm not an engineer. You know, I have a lot of experience looking at intersections, but this is just a first recommendation to one of what could be many solutions to make this very dangerous intersection safer. That is everything. I'm afraid to look at the time. Not bad. It's only 8:40. I have a little bit more to talk to you about. I swore I'd be done within 2 hours, and I will be. And I'm willing to go all night with the Q&A as long as people want to talk. Canal Street is very strange. You know, it's this story, and this is a part of the, as we often do, this is a part of the report that we added that we weren't asked to add. We always find opportunities, you know, areas where there's a need to make improvement that are outside of our study area. Canal Street is within our study area. However, the whole neighborhood south of Canal Street is not in our study area, and so we did not meet with them. And so it's really inappropriate for us to make serious proposals for changing Canal Street without involving that neighborhood. In fact, we wouldn't do it. But I do think this is an area that needs recognition, that needs discussion, and hopefully before too long down the road gets its own planning study. I just want to call to your attention what many of you are probably aware of, but the really fascinating and you know, challenging situation that exists there. Canal Street used to be just this little street to the north, which is the frontage road along Canal. This whole area was added as a highway subsequently. And this was the Dearborn map. This was the map of properties. And you can see the neighborhood to the north and the neighborhood to the south, and what happened in every city across the US just about, which was the poorer neighborhood, the African-American neighborhood, was condemned, and those residences moved in order to allow for this very large highway that cut off the two neighborhoods from each other. Now, I'm very sensitive, you know, I'm coming from New England, and I'm talking to you about this difficult history. I want you to know this happened everywhere. This happened in New York, this happened in Boston, this happened in, you know, you name it. This happened everywhere. It so happens that we're talking about Mobile, and so that's the condition that we're discussing tonight. But as happened in other places, not only did the poorer neighborhood get cut off by the road and condemned, but then those streets were shut. So they couldn't even access the, you know, don't worry if you live to the north, you still have plenty of access to Canal, but from the south, those streets were closed. And so it was a complete walling off, essentially, of the African-American neighborhood to the south of Canal. You know, and when we met with this neighborhood group, they really, you know, we didn't meet with the southern group, so we don't know what they want. But the northern group was really open to the idea of somehow taking advantage of the fact that Canal was oversized and wanting to act upon the less than fortunate history of this location to knit the neighborhoods back together. Now, we're hardly the first, oh, and by the way, you can see the impacts, not just the impacts, but the reality of what Canal Street does with property values, and that some of the wealth to the north could easily benefit the properties to the south if there wasn't such a gully between them. So we're hardly the first people to bring this up. And in fact, the DPZ plan for downtown Mobile, which you're probably quite familiar with, had a very forward-looking proposal for that segment. What you see to the north is the existing trajectory of Canal Street with the frontage road on the top and then the two-sided highway with its center turn lanes at the bottom. And what the DPZ proposal did, pretty straightforward, was to rebuild exactly the destroyed area. So it left the frontage road as the main street through the neighborhood, and then it put building lots on the area where the highway is currently running, and it reconnected the streets. I came up with an alternate proposal, and there were a number of motivations for this, but one of them was that the roundabout has come in, and it's, I guess it just opened today or yesterday, and it's located in this location. But another reason is that the frontage road along Canal exists as a really great street that could be a parking street or kind of a parking lane for buildings that fronted on Canal from the north. So this plan, in contrast, creates all these properties on the what's effectively the frontage road, but also the top half and then some of Canal Street. And so it's the southern edge that's maintained as the throughway. So anyway, it's an alternative. I think that these should be moved forward. And you know, subsequent to this study, it would be great to look at these alternatives and others. And I couldn't help myself as I was preparing this talk to think maybe the best solution, again, that would need to arise out of the neighborhood and conversations with both sides would be some sort of merging that not only would bring the neighborhoods together, but create a space, you know, maybe a space of reconciliation between the northern and the southern neighborhoods. And you would shape it properly with buildings and give it trees and maybe have some sort of civic feature in the middle. But I'm very excited about what this could mean. You know, as someone who plans cities and not just streets, I'm very excited about what this could mean for kind of the next urban move in downtown Mobile. So that's just a little additional part of the plan that that's of course discussed in the report, but I didn't want to ignore tonight as a potential for something really exciting that could help knit the city back together after the damage that was done by the highways inserted in it. So that is everything I wanted to share with you, except that the first part of the report does end with a list of priorities, because the question is, oh my gosh, you know, I mean, there's so much in this plan. It's literally almost every street in the downtown for which we've suggested some sort of change. Obviously, you have to start somewhere. And so we thought about it. We discussed it with you know, Downtown Alliance throughout this process. What's most important? Allison and I have been considering it the whole time. And honestly, I think there are 5 things that need the most attention the fastest. They are Government Street, low-hanging fruit of the work that's already being done, the two-way reversion in conjunction with the signal elimination, having a phase 1 bike plan, and then the parking along Dauphin Street. So just quickly, you know, Government Street, we talked about the scheduled repaving, the scheduled signalization. Clearly that's an opportunity to fix it when those are done. But maybe the goal of safety and saving lives means we front burner those conversations even more so. Secondly, we talked about how the Beauregard Water Interstate intersection was currently under discussion. We talked about how St. Louis Street is currently being rebuilt. We talked about the study that's being done for St. Joseph and how that can be not just made two-way, but restriped properly. And then the immediate construction on Broad Street that enables the sort of interventions that would make crossing it safer, both for pedestrians and for bicyclists. So that stuff, okay, it's happening now. Let's not let this opportunity escape us to influence where we're already spending money on changing our streets. Here's the big one. This is, I think in the book I described it as pulling off the Band-Aid. You can revert one-way streets to two-way slowly and painfully and expensively and confusedly, or you can do it all at once, much more cheaply, much more easily, with a much better opportunity for public outreach, for public awareness, and for greater safety, because everyone knows you're doing it all at once. That's what they did in New Albany, Indiana. You know, I say in the report, the study for St. Louis, sorry, the study for St. Joseph confirmed that you could do St. Joseph, which we should have known. The study for St. Anthony, don't do the study for St. Anthony, okay? You can revert St. Anthony, you don't need a study. But moreover, all of those little one-lane, all those little one-way streets that should be two-way, you can do those all at once. If you don't do the intersections all at once, then often you have to change the signals twice. You often have to introduce new signal heads. You have to do other things that are extremely expensive. If you do the intersecting streets all at once, then you only have to convert the signals to signs. You don't have to do anything in multiple times. But importantly, it becomes this very visible public change that not only shows that people are being progressive about improving downtown, but it's less confusing. It's such a big piece of news that it will be publicized and people will know about it. And so your fear, that's a very common fear, that folks will be confused, they'll avoid coming downtown, or they'll drive around downtown and make all sorts of mistakes because every week a different intersection is different. That can be avoided by having just a big, as quickly as possible campaign to make those changes. So that involves expense, that involves PR, that involves, maybe it takes a little time to get the money together to do it all at once, but I really recommend that you don't draw it out. Other cities are leaving you behind with their street networks. Cities across the country are making this fix and you're not. And you're all in competition for tourism, you're in competition for vitality, and I really don't want to see you miss this opportunity to do that. So the directional changes, as shown, the signalization changes, specifically the reds, as shown, and that's a really big chunk. The bike plan, you don't need to do all of it at once. So, we asked, what is the minimum that you could do? I mean, I guess there's a minimum that's less than this, but what's a really nice half of the bike plan? I think, a lot of people are coming from the south. I think that the Washington Spring Hill connector and the Lawrence Claiborne pair are really important from the south. I think if you want to wait on St. Francis because it's more complicated and just do the east-west pair of St. Michael and Conti in those one-way streets, that makes sense to do early. Remember, there are bike lanes in Conception and Joachim, but also in Claiborne and Franklin. The thing about Claiborne and Franklin is, yes, you want to use up that extra street space, but the fact is that all of these delicate little streets are pretty safe to bike on right now. And they'll be even more safe to bike on when they're two-way. So these are a little bit less necessary to get you through the downtown. So honestly, these streets, Washington, Spring Hill, St. Lawrence, Claiborne, Conti, St. Michael, and Conception, Joachim, that's a really good foundation. If you include the protection of the lanes in the Henry Aaron Loop and the missing link along Water Street. So it's still a lot. I don't mean to suggest this isn't a big ask, but that's what a first phase bike plan would look like. And then finally, as the book says, the plan begins and ends with Dauphin Street. It's your social heart. For the cost of removing a few no parking signs, this liability can be corrected in a single morning if the will is there. And I really hope after this conversation, the will is there, and that can be fixed perhaps tomorrow. So that's everything. As I said in my initial talk to you 2 years ago, you've already got a really nice city. It can be a truly great downtown. It's really on the cusp of that, I believe. But your streets are in the way. as well as being on the way to making it a really, all that it can be. So, and support your symphony. So thank you for your attention. I took 7 minutes less than 2 hours. I'm going to end the show and welcome your questions. Thank you for your patience and sticking with me this long. I see a lot of people did.
Thanks,
Allison,
Joel.
anything you want to chime in before you take questions?
No, this is great. And we've recorded it, so if people want to share with their neighbors, etc., we can also do that. I've been answering some of the questions, some of the more straightforward ones as we've been going along. I think there's a couple of repeat questions that I think might be good for us to answer first, Jeff, because I think it's probably a frequently asked question about transit routes as it relates to the streets. So our understanding is in the downtown, St. Francis, Dauphin, Government, St. Joseph, and Royal, I believe, are the streets that carry the lion's share of transit in downtown. So there's some questions about the lane widths, and do you suggest wider lanes for those that have transit? And can buses go on a street such as, I think there's 1 or 2 instances where there might be a transit street where there are 10-foot lanes going in opposite directions?
Absolutely. So what matters is the physical constraint. Where you have, I know I witnessed this in San Francisco. There was a street with 10-foot lanes, cars parked cheek to jowl on both sides of the street, 2 buses on a very heavily traveled bus route passing each other. And what happened was what everyone would consider a tremendous nuisance, which is that the buses had to really slow down to pass each other. And this happened on occasion. If you're a transit agency, you hate that. If you're running, a bus every 10 minutes and in a heavily trafficked spot, you hate that. But this is on a street that was like one of everyone's favorite streets in America because of that very quality. So it's a question of priorities. That said, what matters there, would I want to design a street like that caused that sort of challenge? Probably not. So on those downtown streets where where buses and trucks are anticipated to pass other buses and trucks, and we welcome our attention being called, and I'm sure it will be because the city cares very much about this. We welcome our attention being called to any errors that we've made, but wherever that constraint exists, it's usually just paint. It's a narrow condition up against a bike lane, where the bike lane is just a stripe in the street. So the idea of vehicles flaring temporarily around other vehicles where those tight squeezes occur, which is very evident if you're a cyclist or a driver as it's happening and you negotiate it, and you negotiate at the sort of low speed that's safe for the street. That sort of thing is something that we've allowed to happen, but only constrained by paint. Now there's one exception that for some reason it didn't make it into my show. Probably the only street that didn't make it into my show is Church Street, where we're recommending a slower flow condition for Church Street. We're recommending that parking be allowed on both sides of the street, which creates about a 17 or 18 foot travelway between the parked cars, which is a problem because your circulator now runs on Church Street. What's it called, Allison?
The MODA.
MODA, your circulator MODA runs on Church Street, but folks on Church Street and elsewhere don't understand why MODA runs on Church Street. It makes more sense for MODA to run on Government Street or some other street with a lot of population of people who take MODA on it. So we've recommended that folks look into the route for MODA. That's the only condition we're aware of in the whole downtown where we've created a constraint that you need to think about before you enable.
Thanks. I think a next priority question, there was one about the bike lane network and if we're inviting more eastbound bike travel on Dauphin by way of where we have our different bike lanes set up with the eastbound, westbound nearby there.
Well,
and what the thinking is on that.
So I think I'm in my PowerPoint now. Hang on. Do you see my PowerPoint?
It did for a second there.
But it went away.
Mhm.
How about that?
Yeah, not in slideshow mode, but.
Yeah, I'm not in slideshow mode because I need to zip along it and find bike plan. So the question was, are we that's the parking plan. We'll use the short term. Well, no, I guess I should go back to the, oh boy, sorry guys. I'm gonna go all the way back to the big bike plan. Here it is. Okay. So first of all, there's a certain type of cyclist who will feel comfortable bicycling with traffic on Dauphin. And I believe in the eastern half of Dauphin and eventually the western half of Dauphin, when it's parked on both sides, people will drive slowly enough that bikes can mix a lot more safely with traffic. That will always remain a choice. But some folks do not feel safe in lanes that aren't lanes and aren't designated. So eastbound travel will be welcome on St. Michael, and it's either paired with St. Francis or with Conti. It's an uneven number, which is okay as long as you have a way in both directions. We do feel that the broad link allows for pretty easy transition north-south as people are coming in. And of course, it takes a while to learn, right? So it'll take a while for cyclists to figure out what the best route is to get from here to there in the plan. And God knows this is a warty diagram. It's far from simple, and it's far from entirely logical. But what it is it's logical in the context of where the space is available in conjunction with the demands that are being placed on it. So, we're confident that if these lanes are all striped, or even if you temporarily don't stripe St. Francis, there's enough of a protected network for those who want it. And for those who wish to stay in the street, on a street like Dauphin, we actually welcome that. We just don't count on it.
Given you have the slides still up, we may want to go to the conversions map. Jeff, can you scan to that? Because there's a question about, there's still a number of one-way streets in our network, and why. We proved some reversions and some not.
Allison, hopefully between us, we can answer that.
Mm-hmm.
Hold on.
Here you go.
Okay.
And they added also that it's hard to give people directions on how to get around downtown.
Yeah, I mean, every street that we convert from one-way to two-way reduces the degree of confusion that you'll have in the downtown. Every street that you see not converted to two-way in the slower speed part of the neighborhoods is because there was some impediment that, at least in the short term, we felt we couldn't get around. In the case of Lawrence and Cedar, I believe it was the signalization on Government. Was there a specific segment that was being, and then, for example, in the case of Lawrence, it was because of the request for bike lane instead of two-way. These streets were all to the east of Hamilton, were all maintained as one-way because they're too busy to be yield streets. They're too busy to have that single 12 to 13 foot travel lane in two directions. From Hamilton West, they're really not too busy for that. And of course, Washington's already two-way. Anything you see that's gray here is already two-way. So all of the exceptions east of Hamilton are due to the fact that they're not neighborhood, slow, gentle streets. All the exceptions west of St. Lawrence, in which a bike lane was requested, were because, and I guess it's just Cedar, was because of, and also isn't the new academy, Barton Academy, coming there? So Barton Academy is coming into this lovely historic building that sits between Lawrence and Cedar, between Government and Conti, and they have circulation issues around drop off and pickup. And that's one reason why two-way travel wasn't introduced there as well. I believe that covers all the exceptions.
Great. There actually aren't too many more questions that aren't that are specifically related to this plan. There's some side topic questions. Let
me add one anecdotal thing. We did something here we've never done before, which is to take a two-way and make it one way. And the reason we did that is on Conception in this one block. Now Conception is all one way, except for this last block against Congress. And you can see that Conception, Joachim, Jackson, and Claiborne all become two-way for their last block. Well, in this particular block of Conception, there is too many people parked, too many businesses, too much activity. And what makes the yield street work is the ability to dive between parked cars. When someone's coming at you, you yield and then you manipulate your vehicle through the openings that occur when there's no parked car on the curb. And what the residents in the neighborhood made very clear to us was that that's not happening. There aren't enough gaps. And so they have a stranglehold of traffic on them for serious parts of the day. And they asked for the last block of their street to be made just like all the other blocks of their street. And we relented and said, okay. Now, I think it's worth stepping back for those of you still here and saying, we're the furthest thing from presumptuous when it comes to what we expect will happen immediately, right? This is a plan that was done for a private organization, albeit a public-oriented private organization, right? But it was done very much in conjunction with the city, with the cooperation of the city, with the assistance of the city, and a general sense that we're all, pushing towards the same goal line. Almost everything I presented you tonight, and I let you know where the controversies are. Almost everything I presented you tonight is stuff that we've already cleared with the city, but except for those issues which I said were still issues. That doesn't mean they're ready to pay for them immediately. And I think that's going to be that's the biggest question in all of these plans. So here, in a sense, my role goes from one of designer and interpreter of community wishes to advocate for, okay, the next step is to raise motivation around doing this quickly. This project was not funded without the anticipation that it would be implemented in part, to a significant degree before too long, but that really requires public money, and public money doesn't come without political support, and political support doesn't come without people raising their voices and asking for it. So here's where, those of you who are involved know that the next step is for us to continue to advocate for what the plan says, to not take it for granted that it's going to happen quickly, and to be the reason that it does happen, or some of it happens quickly. But we've been so pleased with the city's participation. Your engineering department is one of the more progressive and thoughtful and best practices aware engineering departments that we've worked with in some time. Some of the things that we were a little tentative to introduce, like slow flow streets, they were already proposing or proposed to us, right? So the challenge here is not an intellectual challenge, a disagreement, a difference in opinion about what makes a safe street or how to fix these streets. The remaining challenge is going to be motivating the funding behind these changes. And so that's where it's useful to have your voice heard.
Great. I think let's maybe do two more questions. One of them is related to that as a segue. Someone asked if there's a cost estimate for implementing this whole plan. And so I think that's a quick question or a quick answer in relation to the scope.
The answer is no. The answer is no, but I want to tell you, you know, there's a, if you think of Oklahoma City, Cedar Rapids, and New Albany, three plans that have transformed their downtowns that I've worked on. It was three different models of development. One was Oklahoma City was they wanted to rebuild, and they spent $200 million rebuilding, and that happened pretty darn quickly. The second was New Albany, where they wanted to restripe. They didn't have that kind of money. Everything we did was with paint. It didn't add up to a ton of money, and it was done after a brief delay. It was done very quickly. The third was Cedar Rapids, where actually they raised no money. But they decided that as street repairs were made over the next 8 years, because every street was coming up for repaving eventually, they would make the changes as those repavings happened. And so almost nothing happened immediately, and 8 years later it was all done. I would argue that would be a disappointing outcome here. This deserves to be budgeted. But certainly, because it's a paint plan and not a pavement, not a curb and gutter and, you know, new sidewalks and new streetscapes plan, we're not talking about a lot of money. We are not talking a lot of money. Making removing signals and replacing them with stop signs, that ultimately saves you money. It's a little bit of labor cost to bring the signals down, but then those signals can be redeployed somewhere else where you might have had to buy a signal. And, you know, 10, 20 years out, you don't have to replace the signal, which can be a 6-figure deal across a downtown, or 7 figures across a downtown. You know, stop signs are cheap. So, and the bike lanes are just paint. I think the most expensive thing I brought up today was a little Zamboni street sweeper for your bike lanes, which also isn't that expensive.
Yeah, we've also been collaborating with the engineering department to be aware of when resurfacing plans are happening in terms of informing what we did on certain streets, like, for example, ones where other studies are also happening. So there are, as we understand it, also a lot of upcoming resurfacing projects. And so we're hoping that things can be dovetailed with that for some cost savings, even though they need to be budgeted. There's another question about your 180 to 1 crash injury to fire injury data and what your source was for that, Jeff.
So it's referenced in the report, basically searching across different resources for the deaths per capita, injuries per capita due to car crashes and injuries per capita due to fire. So it's a completely national average that bears no relationship to Mobile and may be off by a significant factor, but I doubt it's a factor that outweighs 180 to 1.
All right. I don't see new questions coming in, so I'll say we'll go ahead and wrap up here. As Elizabeth mentioned earlier, we can, you know, facilitate more questions through emailing their address, and they're going to have the report and the recording posted online. And happy to keep the conversation going, especially in light of getting these implemented. Jeff, any other closing comments?
Just on that one point, like I think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of what fire departments do is not fight fires. I mean, a lot of what they do is to go to the car crashes and to handle so many of our emergency situations. So I'm in no way meaning to diminish the importance of vehicles getting in an expeditious way around the downtown. And I understand that doing so needs to remain important. I do believe, though, that a broader focus on life safety as opposed to response time is really necessary in so many of our cities. And the reason I have these data available is because this is an issue we face everywhere, where you know, various, not just fire department, various other, police departments and Homeland Security and other folks focus strictly on the cure and not the solution to injuries and deaths. And the cure is to get the emergency personnel there, but the solution is to not have the crash happen. And since such a large portion of our deaths and injuries in our cities are from car crashes, I do believe an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and that's why I'm so adamant about it, as someone who wants to see the fewest people get hurt. So I think that it's funny because I'm an urban designer. I was trained as an architect. I've watched my career trajectory move from being someone who cared about buildings to then someone who cared about neighborhoods and cities. And I've always been trying to do the least harm or create the most good. And clearly, if you want to create the most good as a designer, then you look at neighborhoods, not buildings, because a neighborhood has a much greater impact on someone's quality of life than the building they happen to be in or not, which they can move out of. But what surprised me the most over the last 20 years is now I spend almost all of my time looking at streets, because it's the streets that are determining the quality of life of the neighborhoods and the safety of the neighborhoods. And when you care about, people's health, and you care about their wealth, and you care about their, economics, their wealth, their economic success, you can care about sustainability, you care about the beauty of the built environment. But it's really hard not to pay attention to people getting hurt. And people are getting hurt in our city streets, and it's principally from cars going faster than they need to be going. So I've watched my focus as a professional migrate, kind of against my will, to this one issue. And if you had told me 30 years ago I'd be giving presentations about safety, I would have been very surprised. But I think it's a way that as designers we can have a tremendous impact on people's lives, and that's why so much of this plan is motivated from a safety perspective. Now, that said, as I began, and to reassure my client, if the downtown isn't safe and doesn't have that kind of low-speed, peaceful streetscape, it also won't thrive from a business perspective. And you're already blessed by a downtown that is so much better than so many in that regard. Most of your streets aren't very big, and most of them do feel pretty safe. But when you can make them feel safer, you make it even better. You make your businesses more successful. Provide more parking, that makes your business more successful. Allow people to arrive by bike, that makes your businesses more successful. So the motivations are beyond just safety, but luckily it all works together towards one happy outcome. So thank you so much for your attention. Super grateful to our client, who's been wonderful to work with, Downtown Mobile Alliance. I have had a long relationship with the city, principally as a visitor. I will keep coming back, and I hope that as I come back, I can see these changes as they happen. So thanks again.
Thanks, everyone. I'm going to stop now.